So, good afternoon. Today, I want us to look at research gaps. I think one of the biggest challenge that we have in research is to identify or to create a research gap to identify a research gap in your research. And I think this is one of the areas that many students usually struggle with, especially when they are doing research in masters, in their PhD levels, and also in the corporate research. Now, one of the things that we need to understand is that a research gap is just a missing piece in research or an area that has not been explored or something that is missing in research. And you want to identify that area so that you can actually be able to do research and create knowledge in an area in that area. Now, the good thing about what is happening today is that AI can actually be able to help you to identify a research gap in different papers that you have identified that you want to look at in your area of the research study. Now we have very many tools. We have many tools that you can use to identify a research gap or to identify a gap in literature, in research, and come up with a research gap, come up with a research that actually solves a problem. Now we have different types of research gaps. You have what we call the literature gap, where you have a problem in literature, where maybe there is an area in literature that has not been studied, or we have areas in literature where the literature that is available is very old, and maybe you want to come up or to identify new areas of literature that have not been studied. So we have what we refer to as also the disagreement gaps. This is where you have different people coming up with different results in a given area of research. You can actually be able to look for a disagreement in research and try to come up with to fill that gap. So we have the contextual gap where maybe people have studied in a given demography and they have not been able to do research in a certain demography. People have done research on female on they have studied female area female. You have a lot of literature on female research targeting female, and maybe you can or you would want to look at the male, you would want to look at different regions, you would want to look at different countries. So all this is what we call the contextual gap. And also we have the methodology gap or the practice gap, where maybe some of the methodologies that have been used in research are old, and you would want to see whether with the change of technology and all these other things, whether if you come up with new methodology, you can get different results from the research. So we have different research gaps that we can actually be able to think about. And today I want us to look at two platforms that we can use to identify the literature gap. So the first one is what I call the Bodel box. The Bodel box platform, and you can see it here. Now, this is a very good platform basically because it is made for academia. So if you look at it, this is one platform, multiple AI tools, your lifelong AI journey from classroom to career and beyond. So this is one research area, the one research platform that has been actually developed for classroom or for professors and all these other people or education materials, and you can see here. And you can actually be able to use these tool to try and look for literature gaps, especially if you have papers. So you get started, you go to get started there, and then after you go to get started, it will actually take you to a point where you will need to do what we call you will need to be you'll get a place where you can actually be able to ask some of the questions. You can see it has taken me to this point, and it is telling me to ask anything. So now what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to come here and say that I'm actually going to develop a prompt. I want to look for papers or research papers that are that that are specifically looking at entrepreneurships in family businesses, in businesses in Kenya. So I'm going to look for research that talks that actually tries to show to do that have been done on family businesses in Kenya. So I'll then wait for Boodlebox to get me some of these papers. So I'm waiting to see whether I'm going to get any paper. So we have all these papers. You can see we have Moai and Tale have written a paper on that. So we have all these papers. You can see them, the research on family businesses. So all these, the 5 papers that you see there, and many others I can actually be able to get if I tell it to add more, talks about the family business, try to show research that has been done on family businesses. So what I can do is to come here and tell Boardbox that I want a research gap to be identified, to be identified from these papers, and please, please indicate the type of research gap identified. So I want to know the research gap that have been identified. So I tell it continue and see the type of the research gap that is going to be identified from those papers. So we can actually read and see what the board box is talking about. So research gap analysis from Kenya Family Business Enterprise Entrepreneurship Literature. Entrepreneurship Literature. So what are these things? Based on the limited information provided about the research paper on entrepreneurship in family business in Kenya, I can identify several potential research gaps. So identified research gaps. So we have the longitudinal studies on succession outcome. So the type of gap we have the methodological gap. Existing research appears to focus on cross-sectional studies that examine the family businesses at a single point in time. There seems to be a lack of longitudinal study that track family businesses through multiple succession events to understand the long-term impact of different succession strategies. So that is one of the research. While we know that only 10 to 15% of Kenya family business survive to the third generation, there is insufficient research tracking businesses through this transition to identify the specific factors that differentiate successful multi-generational transfers from unsuccessful ones. So you can actually be able to see that based on those papers that I've given, you have the longitudinal study, methodological literature gap basically look at that would actually look at longitudinal studies, because most of the studies that have been done are transactional, cross-sectional in nature. So we also have another one here, the contextual or theoretical gap, identified research gap. Technological adoption in Kenya family business is another area. The literature appears to lack focused studies on how Kenya family business adopt and integrate new technologies as part of their entrepreneurial strategies, given the rapid technological changes affecting business globally. Understanding how family dynamic influence technological adoption decisions in the Kenyan context is an area that we can actually be able to carry out. So that is a contextual gap. Remember, I told it to actually identify the type of the gap that they are going to get. So we have another one here, the comparative analysis between urban and rural family businesses. This is another research gap that we can actually be able to look at. We can do a comparative analysis between the family businesses in the urban areas and also the family businesses in the rural family business, the rural areas. So these mentioned studies, like the ones on supermarkets in Nairobi County, focuses primarily on urban settings. There appears to be limited research comparing entrepreneurial orientation and practices between urban and rural family businesses in Kenya, despite the significant difference in market conditions, resource availability, and culture context. So you can actually look at that as a comparative analysis between urban and rural family businesses. So we also have another one here, the gender dynamics in family business entrepreneurship. So I think this is also contextual in nature, that majority of the studies have actually looked at maybe one gender, and we can actually be able to go further and try to see what happens when you look at different gender. So there seems to be an insufficient research on how gender roles and expectations within Kenya family business influence entrepreneurial activities, succession planning, and business innovation, given the importance of gender in both family structure and entrepreneurship. This represents a significant gap, understanding the full picture of family business dynamics in the Kenyan context. So we also have the cross-cultural comparison within Kenya. So that's another contextual gap that we can actually be able to study. So if you look at most of the gaps that I have gotten from those five research is mainly contextual gap. And you can see we have the close cultural, we have the gender, and we also have the comparative analysis. No, the technological adoption. Then we have a population gap. You can see we have a population gap, both urban and rural areas, where you can be able to do a comparative analysis. And we also have a methodological gap, longitudinal study that can also be able to look at some of these challenges. So you can see by just using those five papers, we have a situation where the Boodlebox platform has actually been able to identify the gap that the research gaps that we can actually be able to look at. Remember, I've only used five papers. You can actually be able to attach as many papers as possible. In fact, you can take 40 papers and try to attach them in Bodybox and see how many, what are some of the gaps that you are going to get from there, from those papers. And this makes it easier for us to be able to identify some of the research gaps that we can actually be able to do in a given area. Remember, this is this is just an area on family businesses, the challenges, the family business, entrepreneurship in family businesses in Kenya. And Boodlebox has only taken five papers from the many papers that you can actually be able to do. So this shows that AI is trying as much as possible to make our work very easy, especially when it comes to the most difficult areas that we have been experiencing in research. So you can actually take this gap, like now this one, you can take that gap and come here and paste it here. And maybe tell it Boardbox or the platform to identify the data that can accompany this research gap. Research gap. So we want to see whether there is any data that can actually be able to accompany and explain further the this research gap. So we let me see what I'm going to get from Bodybox. Let me see what I'm going to get. So we already have the information. Gender dynamic in family business entrepreneurship in Kenya support data based on the knowledge provided here is a key data in further explanation and support of the research gap. So you can see 2.7 million female business owners out of the 4.7 million business owners in Kenya. So you have about 2.7 million female business owners compared and the whole business owners, 4.7 million business owners. So 47% of the licensed establishment are owned by male, with women owning a higher number of unlicensed MSC. So this is very important data that you can actually be able to use to beef up your your research gap. Only 18% of firms in Kenya have a female top manager, meaning 82% have male top managers. 47% of firms have female participants in ownership, or 53% have male participants. So all this is literature, the statistics that I have actually uh, asked the platform to give me so that I can actually be able to know that when I'm coming up with this research gap, is there any data that can actually be able to help me beef up the research gap? So women owned MSME report earning only 50%, 57% of the income that male business owners earn. Women owned business have fewer employees. So you can see we have so much data that we have not authenticated, but I think we can now go further to try and see whether we can authenticate this data. Remember, this data is going to help us to beef up our research gap. If we are going to do a research, we are going to use to take this research gap that the platform has given us as one of the research gaps that we can actually be able to use to do a research in this area. So that is how you can actually be able to that is how you can actually be able to use Boodlebox to try and see whether you can be able to get a research gap or identify a research gap in our study, to identify a research gap in our study. So to identify a research gap in our study, remember what I have done. I have actually come here and told, I've actually come here and told the platform, or prompted the platform to get me a research gap in family businesses in Kenya. And the first thing that I did was to look for the papers, and you can see the papers are there. Then after looking for the papers, then I prompted the AI or the platform to get me the research gaps. So I got all these research gaps that you can see there. The four research gaps: the methodological, the theoretical, the population gap, the contextual again, and then I went further to prompt the AI to get me data that can actually be able to beef up my research gap. And you can see I've gotten the business ownership demography, leadership disparity, business performance gap, structural and cultural factors, time allocation constraints, business registration barriers, cultural belief and biases, succession of succession planning changes, and data gaps, all these data gaps from the economic survey. So all this will help me now to develop a research gap that can be convincing enough to those people who actually want to, for me, especially if I want to develop a paper on entrepreneurship in family business and looking at the gender issues in family business. So thank you very much for for listening, and I do hope that I've actually added value in your research endeavors.